Are you married to a US citizen, but you currently don't have your immigration papers and you entered the United States illegally? In this video, I want to talk about the I-601A waiver that is available for somebody in this exact situation. I'm going to talk about what the waiver is for, how it works, how you apply, and how you qualify. So the I-601A waiver is for undocumented immigrants who are going to apply for a green card through a family member. Now, this family member can be a US citizen spouse, it can be a lawful permanent resident spouse, or it can be another family member, such as a sibling. However, the immigrant always needs to have what is called a qualifying relative in order to qualify for this I-601A waiver. So in this video, I want to focus specifically on an undocumented person who is married to a US citizen spouse or a lawful permanent resident spouse, and they last entered the United States unlawfully. All right, so who is the I-601A waiver for? It is for an undocumented immigrant who has a qualifying relative who has one unlawful entry to the United States. What is a qualifying relative? A qualifying relative is a US citizen spouse, a lawful permanent resident spouse. It's also a US citizen parent or a lawful permanent resident parent. So the immigrant needs to have one of these familial relationships in order to qualify for the waiver, the I-601A waiver. Now, in order to win the I-601A waiver, the immigrant needs to show USCIS how their qualifying relative will suffer extreme hardship in various ways if the waiver is not granted. So there's different categories of hardship that USCIS will look at. They're going to look at health hardship. They're going to look at financial hardship. They're going to look at social and cultural hardship. They're going to look at emotional hardship. So these are the broad categories that they're going to look at. And I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail what each of these categories means and the kind of evidence that you can use to support your waiver in each of these areas. So as far as health hardship, USCIS wants to know, does your qualifying relative have certain health conditions that require you as their spouse to be physically present in the United States to help care for them? So that can look like having a condition where perhaps they're having a lot of doctor's appointments, they're not able to do things on their own. They require your support to get to these appointments. They require your support around the house because they're not able to do certain things. Perhaps they're not able to work a lot because of their health problems. Immigration just wants to see evidence of whatever kind of health hardship your spouse has and how that makes them reliant on you. Now, something important to keep in mind is that these health problems don't necessarily need to be extremely severe. So if your spouse has, let's say, a few minor health problems, the goal is to really be able to highlight them and to explain how even though they may appear minor at first, they actually really impact their life. And you want to be able to show how, if you are not physically by their side in the United States, how those health conditions might become worse. All right, moving on to financial hardship. Immigration wants to see who is the primary provider here. Is it you as the undocumented spouse, or is it your US citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse? Who is the one who is bringing home most of the money every month to pay for expenses? If it's your spouse, now it can be a little bit more difficult to show the extreme financial hardship because your spouse is the one who's earning most of the money, not you. However, arguments can still be made, such as if you have children together, you can explain to immigration that while yes, your spouse is earning more money than you are able to take care of your children and other household responsibilities so that your spouse is able to continue working and earning that income. If you are not There, if you were not in the United States, then your spouse is going to have the added expense of having to find, for example, childcare, among, other things that may become necessary, like somebody who's able to be at home when the kids get back from school, or somebody who's able to drive them to doctor's appointments, things like that, because the spouse is busy working. So there are arguments to be made if your US citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse is the one who's earning more of the money. Additionally, you can make the argument that if you're not in the United States, you're back in your home country, that your spouse is then going to have the added expense of having to not only sustain their household in the United States, potentially with children if you have them, but also helping to support you back in your home country as you start to try and rebuild a life there. So again, these are just common examples of arguments that we make in my office that have worked. There's a lot of room to be creative here, and having an attorney who's experienced in these kinds of waivers really, really helps to increase the chances of an approval. Now, the flip side of this is that if you, as the undocumented spouse, are the one who is actually earning more money, well, that's a very good argument to say that if you are not physically in the United States to continue working, of course, your US citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse is going to suffer extreme financial hardship, because you're the one who's earning more money to support the household. And you would want to show that through evidence of your employment, pay stubs if you have them. And lastly, if you both are working and you're both earning relatively the same income, there's still great arguments to be made there as far as the extreme financial hardship to your spouse, because obviously, if they're going to lose about half of their monthly income if you're not here, there's all sorts of ways that they're going to suffer extreme hardship. All right, especially if they do not have a large savings to fall back on. They don't have other, people in the community, such as family members, who would be able to step in to help support financially if you were not in the United States. Moving on to the third category, which is social and cultural hardship. So this is where it's really important to show immigration any kind of involvement that you have in the community, specifically as a couple. So, for example, if you go to church together, you would want to have evidence of that. You would want to have letters of support from people who know you both very well as a couple, who could talk about how this is a very important part of your life. This is very meaningful to you both, and the difficulty that would ensue if you were not in the United States, your spouse was left alone in the United States, how that's going to impact them from a social and a cultural standpoint. Um, Other things include, if you're parts of any groups in your community that are important to you, if you are volunteering in your community in any way, immigration wants to see that you have certain ties to the community that are going to be lost, that would also negatively impact your spouse. Um, Similarly, there are arguments to be made as far as the cultural hardship that would ensue back in your home country. For example, if your spouse were to accompany you back to your home country, perhaps it's a country that they've never lived in before. So, from a cultural standpoint and a social standpoint, what is the type of hardship that they're going to experience there? So again, this is just a very broad overview, but these are the kinds of questions that you would want to have answered in your waiver packet. The next category is emotional hardship. So this is really getting into the heart of your relationship with your spouse, explaining to immigration your dating history, how you met, why you decided to get married, and how you each provide that sense of emotional support to one another. Also, here is when it would be very important to bring up any kind of mental health issues that your spouse may have experienced. Similarly, if you, as the undocumented spouse, have ever had any kind of mental health problems or struggles, here's also where that would be very, very relevant to discuss. Because again, immigration wants to see from an emotional standpoint, what is the hardship going to look like if you two are separated, or if, again, your spouse decided to accompany you to your home country. So is your spouse then going to lose contact with a lot of their family in the United States, perhaps family that they're very close to? How is that going to impact them emotionally? You want to have letters from family members who can also talk about this, in their own opinion. How is their family member, your spouse, going to suffer emotionally if they are not able to stay in the United States because they need to go back to, let's say, Mexico with you if the waiver is denied? Alternatively, how can other people talk about your relationship and how your spouse would suffer if you were to leave by yourself and your spouse is left alone in the United States, perhaps also with your children? From an emotional standpoint, how is that going to negatively impact them, both as your spouse, but also as a single parent essentially at that point? So these are just really general ideas to think about, but generally this is what immigration is looking at for the I-601A waiver. They're looking at hardship that's going to happen here in the United States, and they want to see hardship that would happen if the couple stayed together but left the United States to go back to the immigrant's home country. All right, so without this video getting too long, that is generally how the I-601A waiver works. The last point I want to make, which is extremely important to know, is that the I-601A waiver only waives one thing, all right? It only waives one thing in immigration, and that is having a single unlawful entry to the United States. If you have multiple unlawful entries to the United States, if you have a certain kind of a criminal conviction on your record, if you have a prior deportation order on your record, if you have ever tried to enter the United States with a false document, the I-601A waiver will not work for you. You definitely need to speak to a lawyer to find out what other options may be available, what other kinds of waivers may work in a situation like that. All right, I hope you found this video helpful. Feel free to like and subscribe to my channel. And if you have any questions about this process, call me for a consultation at 760-812-3778.